in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. If you weren't specifically going there, it's unlikely you ever traveled through Trail, British Columbia. It's 7 hours that way to Vancouver and 7 hours that way to Calgary and about 3 hours south to Spokane, Washington, not counting the wait at the border crossing. Tonight, though, we're going to take you to Trail, BC, at least figuratively. Not only that, we're going to revisit 1939 and 1961, 2 years in which hockey teams from Trail improbably won hockey world championships. Take a look.
It's a combination of everything that we instinctively feel is right about hockey.
We always wanted to play for the Smokies.
There was a chance that history was going to be made.
Trail is a town quite near Vancouver.
That was a dream that we had.
I take great pride in the fact that you wore that uniform.
And they were all my brothers.
The league was tougher than today's NHL.
Game of bumps and spills.
My nose broken 6 times.
The guy cross-checked me.
I had 200 stitches in my face alone.
Broke my maxilla bone.
And I lost 4 teeth from the front.
Followed up through and broke my jaw here.
A couple broken on the bottom. There was no quarter asked and none given.
It's not even comparable.
In 1,000 rinks in 1,000 towns, here's the great Canadian game, hockey.
The 1961 World Championship was in some ways the story of
David and Goliath.
There was a team from a tiny little town in British Columbia taking on the big bad Soviet machine.
When we landed in Russia, they had all the spotlights on us.
You wouldn't get off the plane and the guys are with the machine guns.
Sport becomes a stand-in for war.
Crowd is identified as enemy.
The final game of the 61 championship
Started out pretty rough for us.
You could cut the tension with a knife.
There were some pretty tough guys in that team.
The Russians are very stoic. They didn't show emotion.
They didn't take any crap.
We just had to play the best we could, that's all. The Soviets were the Soviets. They didn't want to just win at hockey, they wanted to conquer the whole world. And here was a bunch of crazy mountain men saying, forget it.
Crazy mountain men indeed. That's a clip from a wonderful new documentary, Trophy Town, Local Heroes, International Legends. And we're privileged to have the film's director with us tonight, Robert Barrett, as well as the film's executive producer, Brad Daniels, and the son of one of the 1939 champions, Daryl Scodolero. I hope I didn't mess that up too badly. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to be here.
Brad, documentaries can be gestated in all kinds of different places, but I understand this one actually had its beginnings around a poker table.
That's very true. For many years, I think possibly close to 10 years, Bob and I have participated in a roughly monthly poker game that occurs not far from where I live here in the near the beaches area of Toronto. And the person who was hosting the game that evening, a good friend of ours named Stephen Sweeting. Stephen owns an appraisal company, and Stephen had been retained by the city of Trail to appraise a number of items in their museum, among which were a number of items related to the Trail smoke heaters. So Stephen had gone out and he was doing this job, which I think he had mentioned that we were going out there, that he was going out there. I'd been there a number of times. I have a brother who lives in Trail. But he came back from this job appraising items in the museum, and he said that he had discovered and learned about this amazing hockey team in Trail. Now I had heard about this team, but never really was told the story. Didn't know much about them. I just knew they had this hockey team that people were crazy about out there. So he proceeded to tell us. Now Stephen's an appraiser, and when he learns about something, he learns very deeply. He gets into detail, and he recounted the story of the Trail smoke heaters to us, and just the amazing accomplishments of them. So we were sitting around the table, and our jaws just hit the floor. And the main thing that occurred to us was, we're all in our 50s, 60s, maybe 70s, a number of us, was why we hadn't heard of the Trail smoke heaters, or if we'd heard of them, why we really didn't understand just how unbelievable this story was. And fast forward, Bob, who of course is a documentary filmmaker, Bob called me up a number of days later, got together and said this story, because it hadn't been documented anywhere. And he said, Brad, this is such a great story, which, we all agreed with. Let's make a film. And my role, to be perfectly honest, was to provide some financing to make it happen. I'm not involved in filmmaking. I'm not involved in anything else. I've had a construction company my entire life, and I'm retired now. And that's what Bob needed to get this thing going. It took me about 10 seconds to say, let's do it. And that's how it started. It started with our friend Stephen coming back and actually explaining the story. It was a synopsis. We've learned much, much more since then. But it was about wanting to tell this incredible story, in particular, because we knew, certainly in Eastern Canada out here, that most people weren't aware of it, certainly people below a certain age. And that was really the beginning of this for us.
In fact, Brad, you were quoted as saying, our jaws just hit the floor.
Yes.
We're all saying, why did we not know about this? Why doesn't every Canadian know about this incredible story? So what were the next steps in trying to make it happen?
Well, so that was it. I mean, sort of, knowing that this hadn't been properly documented anywhere, certainly in a documentary film in this way, was important because we needed this to be documented. But the next steps really were started with Bob. Bob ran with it. Bob knows people in the industry, and we really needed to get Bob out there. Bob had writers and editors and all sorts of people that he's worked with over the years. I knew nothing about this really. I mean, what ended up happening here was I provided the seed money to get this going. I did, and my business partner, we sort of jointly financed this. Bob started running with this as we went through this. I mean, I got drawn into it, and was speaking with Bob fairly frequently. And Bob, was sending me stuff, asking me my opinion. I had an opinion. We went through numerous edits. We would brainstorm about how it was coming together, and it took a number of years. I mean, this was a very long process. But we have been so fortunate. I mean, the good fortune we've had in terms of timing has been quite remarkable.
Yeah.
This started before COVID. You'll remember, we didn't know what was coming. Bob was able to get out there and to document, to get all of the footage of the 61 players who are still with us before COVID hit. And if this had been after COVID, this film wouldn't have happened. It just simply wouldn't have been possible. And initially we thought, oh, let's get this out and get it ready for the 60th anniversary of the 61 win. We thought that was really our target. That wasn't possible, obviously, because of COVID. And we were a little bit, let down because of that, because we thought that would have been such a great time to do this. But as it turned out, it wasn't necessarily the best time. It occurred to us at a certain point that there was a connection. There was that the 72 win of the Canadians in the Canada Summit Series was a related story. I mean, it really was. And we realized that there was going to be a lot of attention around hockey at that time. And we came to understand that it was something that really would play very well in concert with the 72 story. And it does. And you can tell the opening lines in the film actually reference that everybody knows about 72. Everybody, has been focused on that now. And yet, and I think quite rightly, it deserves its place as sort of the ultimate Canadian series and win. But I think this is number 2. I really do. And the difference in terms of how well known those two events are is staggering, that more people don't know about the 61 win. And the 39 win, in fairness, it's so sad that the 39 win wasn't documented. I mean, every time I hear about the record that the goals for and against in 39 was 42-1. When does that happen? I mean, really, it's remarkable, and it's really too bad that we couldn't have documented that in the same way we were able to document 61.
Bob, you've been quoted as saying, as the film's director, this was never a film about hockey. It was always about brotherhood and community. What did you mean by that?
Well, whereas I love hockey, I was raised watching the Maple Leafs, and sadly, it's been a while since they've won the cup. But nonetheless, I was raised around, and I played hockey as a kid. But as a filmmaker, I didn't really. The idea of making a sports film didn't really do much for me. But the idea that this is a small community that took on the world, that really interested me a lot. And there's so that's what drew me in, because this team, whichever generation you want to talk about, the 39 guys or the 61 guys, they couldn't have done it without the community. And it's established in the film. I mean, the community was so passionate about their hockey because there really wasn't anything else going on in Trail. Daryl talks about that in the film, and the fact that it was a company town in many ways. And what made it fascinating is the fact that the company would hire people to come and work in the plant, but they'd be scouting for hockey players. So if you were a hockey player with a good skill set, a competitive skill set, and you could and you would needed work, because this was it's not an NHL situation. It was like you needed to work, and then the hockey was a sidebar thing. It was your side passion. And so the company was looking for guys who wanted to make a living but wanted to play competitive hockey. And the community, so they would come and live in the community. And as we find out in the film, of the immigration of the community, of a large Italian population in the community, a lot of the hockey players actually have Italian, or they were Italian kids growing up. And so I just found it just fascinating that hockey could flourish in a place like this. It's in the middle of, I consider it in the middle of paradise, and it's such a beautiful setting. So to me, there's a photograph right there, and that's the Columbia River. and it's absolutely a gorgeous place. So people would come from thousands of miles from Europe or whatever to settle there and to work in the plant. You can see the smokestacks there, and it's kind of like what I love about Trail, and Daryl can talk about this extensively. I love the fact that in a way the smelter sits on the top of a ridge and overlooks its fiefdom, so the town is below, and all the workers go to work there, and you've got to walk up or drive up to the plant. So it was kind of fable-like in a weird kind of way. It was, it's like, so I was just fascinated by that element of it. I really want to tell that story. And so for me, it's a story about a community that just happens to have embraced an incredible group of generations of hockey players who took on the world, right? And I just found that's a story that we needed to tell.
Yeah, Bob, if I could just jump in there. I think you're selling yourself a little bit short, because I remember specifically either the first or second time we met to talk about making this film. I was focused initially on just, what a great story this was, like, let's tell the story of this tremendous team and this, and these great wins. And I remember what you said. You said, I'd like to look a little deeper than that. You said, what is it? Why did this team produce such excellent hockey players when they were so good? And it was like you wanted to explore the sort of broader issues. I mean, was this just a freak thing? What were the conditions necessary that existed to produce such excellence? And something I've spoken to people a lot about is that on the surface, the film is just recounting the story of the Trail Smoke Eaters, but the subtext, the real story behind that, to me, is why Canada in particular has produced such excellence in hockey players, and what the conditions were that allowed that to arise. And for me, what I learned from this, and I think that someone really studying this film will understand, is that it's a story of the way that Canada was colonized and developed. Industry came in and moved through the country, whether it was lumber or mining or what have you. And very often in very remote places, as Canada was populated with people, all of these little towns grew up all over the place. And the way I look at it is that industry understood that if they wanted workers to come there and to stay there, they needed to have a happy, healthy community. And the smart industries, and Kaminko was a very smart, operator in this. They understood very well the role that a strong community played in maintaining a good workforce. And that's what they wanted, was a good workforce, let's be clear. But they really supported all the local sporting organizations because they understood that sport plays such a central role in galvanizing communities and creating community spirit and creating a happy, healthy community. The other part of that is, like we touch on in the film, immigration. I mean, if you want to attract people to these smaller communities, it involves, or at least it certainly has in Canada and the US as well, it involves immigration. So immigrants were coming in, and what did they want? They wanted jobs, and they wanted to build communities, and Trail is a great example of that. So all of these elements are what produces this, and Trail is probably the best example. The Smoke Eaters are probably, I think, the best example. But let's not forget that there were many, many other communities across Canada that had club teams that did extremely well as well. Trail being the best of all of them. But when you look at Trail as a case study, it explains all these other small towns all over the country and why Canada has produced such phenomenal hockey players and other athletes over the years. I just think it's really interesting to look a little bit beyond the story on the surface here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why, anyways, I just to jump in here on that, it was important for me to show the relationship between the smelter and the town, but without overplaying that card. In other words, yes, everyone worked there, and we could have gone in all sorts of other places in that regard, but That's why in the film you see from how the plant keeps showing up because it's omnipresent. It's constantly there. It's a reminder of why everyone. There you go. There's the rink, and there's the arena in the background, or the arena in the foreground, and the plant in the background. And so they're constantly reminded about why everyone is there. So to Brad's point, absolutely. I mean, and that's why in some of the players in the film talk about how many years they served at the plant, what they did, and it's a phenomenal story about guys who are so dedicated to their families, to their work, but also to their love of the sport.
Daryl, you're coming to us from Trail tonight, right?
Well, no, I live just in a suburb of Vancouver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, for the people in Trail, because as Bob and Brad have said, the town itself is part of the story. That, as Bob said, these guys came from this exotic, beautiful, remote place in Canada, went overseas and kicked the baddest asses on the block. So do you think to this day that that's still a source of pride in the community?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Even though this took place 60 years ago, there's still our generation that remember it. I was probably 13 years old while this was all going on, and it was the place to be. Everybody went to the arena, and everybody cheered for the Smoke Eaters, and it was, as we've been noting, very, very exciting time.
Daryl, tell us about your dad, Duke Scotolero, the goalie for the Smoke Eaters in the 1930s. He was actually quite an innovator at the position.
Well, yeah, he came from the Crow's Nest Pass, which is the southernmost Rockies pass between Alberta and British Columbia. And it's coal mining. And his future was going to be tied up in the coal mines. And he managed to pick up hockey as a sideline to get through the winters there. They're pretty severe winters. And he taught himself how to stop a puck, essentially. And that led him to Trail, where the Smoke Eaters were recruiting talent. And that allowed him, that was his way, his ticket out of the coal mines into a much better job at the, well, he worked as in office type situations for Kamenko at the smelter. But I guess as he developed his skills, he actually joined the team right at the proper moment where they were able to, in 1938, win the Allen Cup, which is the Canadian Amateur Men's Championship. And then the following year, they were entitled to go to the Worlds. And they were very successful over there. But just to keep things in perspective, you have to remember that hockey was very well developed in Canada at that time in the late 30s. And the competition throughout Canada was very strong. So for them to win the Canadian Championship was quite a big deal. That was a very big deal because they were going up against Eastern teams, and the Allen Cup still exists, and it's still played with amateur men's hockey, although not to the same degree because junior hockey has really replaced the Canadian amateur men's. But for them to win Canada, I think they played the Cornwall Flyers in the final series for the Allen Cup in Calgary. They were very proud, and as they should have been, to win Canada. And when they went to Europe was still in the early stages of developing hockey. So when you look at the stats and you say, wow, 41 goals and 1 against, the competition wasn't there yet at that time. They were developing hockey, and they were looking at Canada as, oh my gosh, this is how we can play if we get our game together. So when the Smoke Eaters, when Dad's team came back, they were pretty humble, and yes, it was nice to win the world, but that was more in name than it was in stature.
Well, let's back up a second.
Yep.
Before we leave your dad as an innovator, you sent me some photos of his blocker glove.
Yeah.
And there's a story behind that because he made some additions. There wasn't really a blocker on the glove before your dad, right?
Well, yeah, the story that's been related to me by my dad and others, including his brother, was that when they were in the playoffs for the Allen Cup in Calgary, somewhere along the road, he took a puck on the back of his glove hand. And the gloves for goalies in those days were pretty much very similar to players' gloves. And he really damaged his hand so that he could hardly hold I'm not sure if he broke some bones in it or what, but he says he could hardly hold the stick. And he asked that they use the backup goalie, but they said, no, you have to play. We need our number one goalie. And so he tinkered with it, and he put this contraption on the back of his glove hand, and he strapped it on. And then he tinkered with it some more. He needed some padding between the hard metal. I don't know if he used a piece of wood or metal at the time, probably a piece of wood. And then he wanted to have a cushion on top of that because he used to, let's see if I can show you. He used to trap. The puck would hit that, and then he would trap it on the stick hand. And the story goes that, and this is what he relayed to me. Again, it's legend. I can't verify it. He said that after one of these games, a representative from CCM came down to the locker room and asked him about this, wanted to look at it. And my dad explained what he was doing and why he had to do this. And the representative from CCM thought that was pretty cool. And apparently the next year, CCM put out the blocker. But that's all legend. I can't verify it. It's just a good story.
You and your wife, Jane, were nice enough to model this is a replica, I believe, 1939 Smoke Eaters sweater. And I want to focus on
that's a good replica, actually. It's very accurate.
And as Bob was mentioning, the logo, it's got the smokestacks, the Kaminko gold mining smelter, the burning gases and billowing smoke coming out of the smokestacks. And it's quite an unusual logo, isn't it?
Yeah, it's iconic, they say. And yeah, it's very cool.
And this is
that's representing both teams. That's representing the 39 team and the 61 team. And they had a ceremony in Trail for one of the anniversaries of the arena. And they asked representatives of the families to go to that ceremony. I wasn't able to go, but my uncle Mario Scotolero attended, and that's the jersey on the right that represented the 61's world championship sweater. We called them sweaters back then because the one that Jane's holding up, the one on the left, the replica, is actually a modern jersey, but the original was actually a wool sweater.
Speaking of originals, this is not a replica, right?
No, that's the real thing. We have that in our collection here. Yeah.
And it's still in good shape, too.
Well, again, here's my theory, is that it didn't get worn much because they were humble about the fact that they won the Worlds.
Interesting.
But if you see old photos, you'll see those guys wearing their Allen Cup jackets all the time, everywhere. And I've just been putting this together in the last several months that I think, because I never saw the Allen Cup jacket at home. I don't remember it. I think it might have got worn out. So they were so proud of the Allen Cup, and they didn't walk around bragging, look, we won the world, we won the world. Mm-hmm. I think they were humble enough not to bang that drum. That's that era. That's not the case with the 61s. Total different era. You got 20 years of hockey development in Europe taking place. So the 61s was a big deal to win the world.
One more question about your dad, the goalie. He had a nickname, Meet You Halfway.
Yeah, he liked to roam. And I guess in those days, let's be honest, the game would have been slower. The skating skills and that would have been slower. You would have had more time to move out. If you ever saw goalies doing that in the modern day, they'd be shot. They would not be encouraged to do that, to roam way out of the net. But he had the time and he had the skills to do that. So that's what they sometimes felt that he was another defenseman sometimes. Yes.
Bob, you've brought up, and Brad has brought up, that the Kamenko smelter is an important part of this story, and that they understood the power of sport to galvanize communities. One thing that's amazing to me is that these guys would work a full 8-hour shift, often a very physical shift. Then they'd have to go to hockey practice. I find that hard to even imagine.
I know that's what I found so astounding. And if you look at where these guys worked, there were sets of stairs that go up. I don't know how many stories Darren might be able to tell you, but 4 or 5 stories. I mean, everything about working and living in trail it's a workout. And then we kind of illustrate that in the film. It's a very beautiful place, but it's rugged. And they would be training. I think there was a clip from Ed Christoffoli where they all talked a bit about being coached by Bobby Crum. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but at any rate, conditioning was a very big part of their winning ways, as far as I'm concerned. And because it wasn't enough just to be a good player, these guys had to kind of have the stamina to keep up. And so it was, you work all day, you spend your couple of hours at the rink, and you go, and they were put through their paces. I'm talking about the 61 guys in particular, because they could personally talk about it. And it was a commitment. It was a commitment to living out there, to working at the plant, to raising a family. A lot of these guys had 3 or 4 kids. And then they worked these shifts at the plant. So, an amazing group of people for sure.
We will focus on the 61 team, but before we do that, sure. This is a photo of the 39 team. And as Daryl said, to earn the right to play for the World Championship, Trail first had to win the Allen Cup in Calgary. So, Bob, tell us about the Allen Cup, how important it was even back then, even in the 30s, and talk about the entourage from Trail that took the train trip up to Calgary with the team.
Well, of course, they dubbed it the Smoke Eater Special. And what that entailed was about 700 or 800 of their dear fans climbing on board the train. And I can only imagine what a party that would have been. And they would have traveled from the mountains to Calgary to play. And upon their return, when they were victorious, it was absolutely insane. We have imagery of footage of them returning home to the Kootenays and the Trail But look at that photograph. Like, that is mind blowing. I don't care where you're from. That is how much that team was revered. That is how much that team meant to those people. Look at it. It's like chock-a-block, thick, full of people that came out to, and the guys would drive through the streets as both era teams would. Part of the celebration was them aboard the fire truck and being piloted through town so that everybody could cheer them on, and the band would play and everyone would dance, and I'm sure there was might have been a couple of beers had, and it was a huge celebration. Look at that. It's like that. So that really touches your heart, right? That joy with that team winning the Allen Cup was it meant everything to them. And it goes back to what Daryl was saying. I mean, I think internationally, I think the international trip was that in and of itself. I mean, the fact that they had to travel across Canada and go across the ocean, and someone in the film says it's like going to outer space. So that would have been its own trip. But I mean, the Allen Cup meant so much to these guys, and it meant so much to the town. Everyone knew, not just the team, but everyone knew in Canada how important the Allen Cup was.
We should point out that if 700 people went with the Smoke Eaters up to Calgary, there were 7,000 people who were there to greet the conquering heroes coming back, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Now, as you say, to get to Switzerland for the World Championships, they played exhibitions across Canada, and not just to get ready, but also to raise funds. Then it was a steamer that took them to Scotland, sold out matches across Europe, some on soccer fields, 54 games in total, 9 countries over 3 months. And as has been mentioned, they really did dominate, didn't they, Bob?
Yes, they did. Yeah, and Brad mentioned that earlier. Yeah, it was. They conquered for sure. They went over there and conquered. And remember, they were over there at a time prior to World War II, where there's a lot of tension going on in Europe, obviously, and they played in Germany the Christmas in late '38, because you're right. They were gone for like 3 months. And they played exhibition games in Germany prior to the tournament itself. And great photos, by the way. I haven't seen some of the photos. So
those are the Allen Cup jackets.
Yeah, those are. Yeah, I love the
Those are the ones they wore all over Europe. And
those guys they're great, super handsome, and they look like Hollywood stars, don't they?
Yeah. That's my okay.
Yeah, there's
Bunny,
your dad and
my dad and Bunny Dames.
Bunny, yeah.
Kind of fancy that. That's Deutschland. That's in Germany, obviously.
Yeah. At any rate, as the film discusses, and Daryl could say, I mean, they just had the time of their life, right? I mean, they're a bunch of young guys. Another great photo. Jeez,
you've got to put in perspective that most of them were 23, 24, 25 years old. They were kids.
And think about how far they had to travel. They were like 7,000 miles away from home or something like that.
I'm still trying to figure out how they physically moved from one place to another. I mean, most of it by train or bus.
Yeah.
But what about all their equipment? What about the laundry requirements? How was that managed? There must have been some incredible organization in the background to keep that ship afloat.
Yeah, for that long, you're right. Yeah.
And guys, Daryl shared with us these wonderful photos, and it wasn't all business while they were in Europe.
That's right.
This is Duke as well as Bunny and Mickey getting pedicures while they were in Europe. So good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the story behind that. I only have the photograph, so I can.
And this one is, I think, of a skiing trip while they were in Europe.
Yeah, they were in Switzerland, right? So they were probably in some famous area out of, it was either Basel or Zurich at the time.
Yeah, I love that shot.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine a modern day organization allowing their guys to go skiing during a tournament.
So,
No,
Brad,
that
you
would
know who else noticed the 39 Smokies? The father of Russian hockey, the legendary coach Anatoly Tarasov. So decades later, Tarasov said of the 39 team, quote, the Smoke Eaters passing and puck control became the model for hockey in the Soviet Union. So that makes me think, while the European influence on the North American game is well documented, Trail, and this was true of both the 39 and 61 teams, had an influence on hockey in Europe.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something, it's a theory I have. I remember in the 70s, in particular 70s and 80s, in the NHL, people talking about the European style of hockey, sort of fast skating, sort of wide open passing, and not being as physical. The European players were sort of derided for not being as physical. But when I followed the story of the Smoke Eaters, and this would apply to other club teams in Canada as well, what has occurred to me is that the style of hockey that the 39 Smoke Eaters and other Canadian teams brought to Europe, in particular the Smoke Eaters, was noticed in Europe. And it's documented in our film that a number of the guys after 39 were recruited back to Europe to coach. Mikey Buckna is one that's mentioned in the film, and he coached the Czech team, and is sort of regarded, I suppose, as almost a sort of father of modern Czech hockey. And it occurred to me that this style of hockey that they witnessed with the 39 Smoke Eaters, where they, sort of dominated in 42-1 in terms of goals for and against, sort of spread through Europe in places like Czechoslovakia. They took this on, and they all got much better. But later on, many years later, in the sort of 60s, 70s, and so on, when European players started to come to North America to play in the NHL, the style of hockey that was thought of as European, I think, had something to do with the Canadian teams that went over and played in these tournaments, like the Smoke Eaters did in 39. And then, of course, the story in the film about the 61 team is fascinating, in that hockey had changed very much in Canada from 39 to 61. And there's a lot in the story about how physical it became. It became extremely physical. And when the 61 team went over, and this is what's one of my favorite parts of the film, is listening to Don Fletcher talk about what happened when they showed up in Sweden, and they were sort of derided. These guys were jet lagged. I think most of them had never been on a plane, certainly that far before, across the ocean. And when they were beaten the first time, and they were made fun of for being kind of lightweights, not very good players. In fact, Don Fletcher shows a picture that was a drawing that was made of him in the paper where he had fairy wings. They were making fun of him. And he says in the film, that was it. And the next game, they became exceedingly physical, he in particular, and they talk about how they were literally run out of town. And he says that that's what put that team together, and that's what carried them through to their success in 61. And that's the style of hockey that I remember in the 70s, where we had, bench clearing brawls and whatever. That style of hockey didn't exist in 61 in Europe. And the Canadian teams went over, and the Smoke Eaters in particular were able to once again dominate over there because they were playing a different style of hockey. So I just find it's very interesting how the styles of hockey went back and forth.
Just to put a bow on the 39 team, Trail shut out the U.S. team 4-0 to become champions. And Daryl, do you know the story of why the 39 team that we're showing again here, why they were not wearing Team Canada sweaters?
I believe what happened was that the organization, I guess with the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association was going to provide sweaters for them, but they were going to have to pay more than they could afford to get those sweaters because they needed to pay their own travel costs. It's something to do with that. There was an issue about affordability of wearing the Canadian sweater. So they said, fine, we'll just go and wear the Smoke Eaters sweater. And as that turned out, that became a story unto itself. So it's kind of cool.
As we transition to the 61 team, I do want to mention one very unusual story that actually took place during World War II with one of the 39 Smoke Eaters. Bob, I'd like you to pick up this story. We're looking at one of the 39 players, Safronov, who was a World War II pilot. And what is the story of Steve Safronov?
Well, actually, Steve Safronov was for the 39 team in the late 30s. He was actually a Boy Scout at the time. And what he did was, he would attend the bench with the team doctor. So if a player was cut or they needed some attention, he would be there to assist. And they were his heroes. And Darryl will attest this. All these guys are like local heroes. Well, there you go. It's in the tagline of the film. But so he was given a jersey by one of the guys, and he so that was in 38, in the late 30s, when World War II came about. Steve joined the RCAF, and he became a member of a crew on an RCAF bomber. They were in Halifax. They flew Halifax bombers, and as Stephen and his crew were shot down over Germany, and Stephen was wearing his jersey as a good luck charm underneath his flight suit. And this is what's incredible. So they get shot down. They parachute out of this burning, crashing Halifax bomber. They get captured by the Germans, and they're captured by some local police and Germans in Germany, and they were held for a few days prior to being sent to the Stalag. And as it turns out, that the main jailer, the sergeant, was at the hockey game, one of the games where the Smoke Eaters played in late 38 against the Germans at Christmas time, that exhibition game I mentioned earlier. He absolutely loved the team. When he saw the jersey, he took pity on these poor guys, and he gave them shared stocks of food with the guys, and by and large just made their lives easier. I mean, maybe saved their lives, but it's such an incredible story of how the brand ended up saving or certainly making life a lot easier on these guys. Certainly at that point in their as they were captured. So I think that was like really powerful. And to put another button on that, he was sent to Stalag Luft 3, which was the home of the Great Escape. And everyone, I'm sure who's watching this will know the film, The Great Escape, and starred Steve McQueen. Well, of course, it was based on a prisoner of war camp, which was just for airmen in the Second World War. And a couple years back, I'm also working on a film now on the Royal Canadian Air Force, Ron Bell. Big shout out to RCAF. One of the fellows we were interviewing was interviewing a 100-year-old gentleman who was also at the camp, and he was a spotter for the guys who were digging the tunnels. And he remembers Steve Safronov. He says, I never knew the guy, but I remember seeing him wearing his jersey underneath his flight suit in the camp. And I thought, what are the odds of that even occurring. The fact that I even talked to somebody who was even in that camp. That gentleman, George, has since passed, but he was the last surviving Canadian from that camp. You know, talk about a small world. But anyway, that's a fantastic story.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, it makes sense because that logo and that sweater, I keep pushing sweater because that's what they were. They needed sweaters back in those days with all the open air rinks.
Yeah.
They needed to be warm, even though you're working hard as in the sport. It's cold. To the fact that my dad had a trademark ball cap on his head to keep warm. And so that sweater with the logo, as Bob was saying, it was well known through most of Germany because of the games that were played throughout many different regions.
Brad, you touched on this, and I want to delve into it a little further as the documentary does. Senior League hockey in 1961, not a sport for the timid. I mean, can you give us some description of just how rough and tumble it was?
Well, again, probably my favorite sequence in the film comes from Cal Hockley, where all the guys are talking about just how brutal it was, and Cal talks about a game in, and I forget where it was. I think it was Spokane or somewhere. And he says that he went into the corner in the first period and got the butt of a stick in the face. And he says that he lost his 4 front teeth and cracked a couple rear molars. And of course, he said that, you know, fortunately said they knew a local dentist. So they put him in a car. He said he was bleeding. They had a towel around his head to stop the bleeding. Or when they took off towards the dentist, and on the first corner, they forgot to lock the door, and he had a towel around his head. He fell out of the car onto the road, picked him up, put him back in the car again, brought him to the dentist's office. And he says, I spent the entire second period in the dentist chair. And then he turns to the camera and says, and I scored a goal in the third. And to me, that just tells you what sort of hockey they were playing back then. It's a great sequence.
And you know what, Brad? I didn't include it in the film, but he went to say after that, goes, and then after the game, I went out. We had steak. Is that crazy?
Yeah.
These were tough guys.
Yeah. It sort of reminds me, my father played lacrosse in a similar era, the late 50s. And he was telling me that, and he played at a high level. He played for the Mann Cup out in British Columbia. And he said it was a regular occurrence in those days that when fights broke out, he said they were just so brutal. The only way they could stop them was, he said, they would turn off all the lights in the arena, because he played box lacrosse indoors. And he said there was nothing else they could do. Nobody knew who they were hitting. And that's how they had to stop fights.
Oh, my goodness. Did it work?
Apparently he lost one of his teeth. But,
oh gosh. Okay, so Brad, in 1961, this is another oddity. Trail should not have been the team that was playing for the World Championship. So how did they end up being the ones to go?
Well, they played for the Allen Cup, and they were defeated by Chatham, I believe. But and who was it? Cesar Maniego was playing for Chatham, who was a Trail boy. Anyhow, they ended up losing that game, so they didn't win the Allen Cup. Chatham could not afford to make the journey to Europe to represent Canada. So by default, Trail was offered the opportunity, and they took it up, and the community supported them. They were able to raise the money through the community to be able to go there, which says a lot about the community of Trail.
It also says something about the executives, both with amateur hockey, Bob, and also with the leaders of the Maple Leafs and the Canadians, who didn't offer their support, which is hard to believe watching it. When I was watching the documentary, just how dismissive the Canadiens general manager Frank Selke was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. They were dismissed outright, and they had no support, and they kind of felt there again. The community embraced the team, and they raised the money to send them over. It was like $40,000 or something like that. Millions and millions shy of what the '72 Summit team had to work with. And these guys went over there, and they we know what the outcome is, but the community definitely pitched in, and they sent these guys over, and it was like I think someone described the film. Members of the community going around and collecting $2 bills or quarters, nickels, dimes, just to make sure that the team made it, and of course they as Brad indicated earlier, a lot of them had never even been on an aircraft before. Cal Hockley says in the film he couldn't believe it was actually happening until he looked out the window and he saw the wind flapping or the wing flapping and realized they were finally on their way. They were actually going to do it. But Montreal and Toronto, and Daryl can probably talk to this actually, because quite often Western Canada felt a bit maligned by Eastern Canada. It felt like all the pro teams were out east, all the focus was out east. Not saying, and there were great players from the West that did come and play, but by and large, a lot of the communities out west just felt like they were being overlooked by, and that's why in the film there's a scene at the end of the film where you see a bunch of guys walking around a coffin in the parade, in the victory parade, and it says something about rest in peace Eastern sports writers or something.
Yes.
Right? And Daryl, why don't you talk to that? Because I think that's really interesting, because you would have been, that would have been your era for checking teams out, right?
Yeah. No, rightfully so, though. I mean, we're a small town in Never Land, way out west, and not making many waves. Again, Cominco comes to the rescue. Apparently, they made sure that the players' wages were covered on that trip, and that was a very big deal. That was a very big contribution for players to be away and go away and come back to assured jobs, and that kind of support was huge. But the Eastern Western Canada thing, it always goes on. It's still going on today in various factors and fashions. It's nothing new, and it probably will never end.
Another thing that occurs to me as well is that between 39 and 61, a lot had changed in terms of international hockey. Canada at that point was still being represented by a club. So we didn't have national hockey teams. And right. Whereas in Europe, in many respects, they were actually a somewhat more sophisticated. I mean, they did have national teams over there. So we were sending, the best club team who were drawing from a very small community of people to play and sending them over to Europe to play against national teams. And hockey was gaining in importance in Europe in a big way. They were becoming very good. And that's a very, very good point. And coupled with the fact that at the very same time, increasingly, the prominence and importance of the NHL was increasing. So the pool of players available to clubs like Trail was diminishing, because increasingly the guys were looking at the opportunities, right? And we talk about this in the film where, certainly in 39, but, through the 40s and 50s, a lot of these guys were offered contracts in the NHL, but they looked at it. The NHL didn't necessarily pay very well. They'd have to be away from their families for extended periods of time. And the option of playing hockey at a very high level with the possibility of representing your country internationally and having a good paying job for life was a better deal in most cases. And certainly it was in Trail for a very long time, which is a credit to Cominco. So you can imagine that, a lot of people would look at this at that time in 61 and say, hey, we're going to send this little company, this team from this little town over to Europe to play against, the Soviet Red Army team. Come on, it really was at that point a David and Goliath thing.
Brad, I want to pick up on something you touched on earlier, which was one of the first games after the 61 team goes over, crosses the pond. They play 2 games against the Swedish national team, and they get beat in the first one. And both the Swedish national team, the fans, the media are talking about how the team from Trail is soft. Well, after the second game, they were talking about them somewhat differently. They were gangsters, they were goons, they were butchers, and that it really did galvanize the team. So in a backhanded way, they actually did the boys from Trail a service, didn't they?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, they were insulted. It was, I don't know how to put it. It was a matter of them being called soft or easy or, not being tough. And that really offended them. And they decided to show them what tough really was. And they moved on from there. It really did galvanize the team. And it made the teams in Europe understand that a different form of hockey had evolved in Canada. And of course, over time, it dominated the game.
There are many parallels between the 61 experience and the 72 experience. And in Sweden is also where the 72 Team Canada, was galvanized. They had some rough games. Blood was spilled. Tongues were cut and needed to be stitched up. The Swedish press called the Team Canada players goons and playing a sport other than hockey. And in both cases, before playing the actual games that are remembered, the games in Sweden ended up being very consequential.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the one of the other things that occurs to me, I mean, the stories behind the 61 team from Trail and 72, just sort of comparing the two, I find it very interesting. To me, the notion of a team, and this is another thing that I've watched the film many, many, many times. And the first number of times I watched the film, Cal Hockley talks right at the beginning of the film. And he says, when you look up the definition of team in the dictionary, you should see Trail smoke eaters. And it sort of it didn't really settle with me, or it didn't resonate with me until later. And I kept thinking about it. And I thought, that is such a significant thing for him to say. Because in 72, and we've all watched about 72 recently, and we all know about 72. And one of the themes in 72 was that, Canada thought that just by putting together the best hockey players in the world on a team, that it would be a no-brainer, that we would roll over the Soviets. There would be no problem with that. And I think they dismissed the power of people working together as a team. And the Soviet team, these guys played together, 11 months a year all the time. And that made a difference. And that's the same thing with the smoke eaters. I mean, they were a team. They played together all the time. They represented a community. And when you stop and you think about what people are playing for, the guys from Trail were playing for, their families, their community, their brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Everybody knew everybody, and it meant something to them. If you just throw a bunch of people together, no matter how good they are, they don't have that same reason for playing together. And I think that those two things are very interesting.
To work off of what Brad was just saying there, I mean, Ed Christoffel says in the film, they'll never happen again. 8 guys who lived in that town, because some of the other players were imported to be able to go and play. They came late to the team, but they would play overseas. 8 of the guys called Trail home, and that will never happen again. To Brad's point, these guys grew up. These guys were buddies. They grew up, and it's so that was kind of their secret weapon in a way, right? that ability to kind of know each other and watch each other's backs. Ultimately, I think that's absolutely deciding factor.
Yeah, I mean the Soviets, the guys played together, 11 months a year. They certainly were a team, and they were very cohesive. But unlike Trail, they weren't all from the same town. They didn't represent a town; they represented a country, which is important. But a bunch of guys representing the hometown where they actually grew up. A lot of them, they knew everybody. These guys worked together. They played together. They were neighbors. They saw each other in the community, and I think that that's a huge part of why they were so successful.
That's another point, Brad. Another good point is that we knew them. Everybody knew one of these players. They were either neighbors or they were relatives or friends of so and so, and so they had that pressure on them.
Absolutely.
As role models. That everybody would be, if they messed up, they'd hear about it the next day from somebody or someone, and their behavior and their skill level, their drive and their work ethic on the ice was being scrutinized.
Yeah, and I think that it meant, I think that for the guys in Trail, it probably meant as much for them to play against Kimberley or Spokane or somewhere else as to play against the Czechs. You know what I mean? I mean, sort of representing your community, whether it was on the world stage or whether it was against the community down the road, was almost on par for them, And in the film, they talk about how in '39, when they went over and Team Canada, Canada would not pay for their jerseys. They maybe had to pay for them themselves. And they said, you know what? We're just as happy to wear our Trail Smoke Eaters jerseys when we represent Canada, because guess what? We're actually representing Trail. And I thought that was very significant.
What I love about the connection between the two teams, and Daryl can talk to this, is the 61 guys revered the 39 guys, and everyone in town did. And a lot of the 39 guys went on to coach other local kids to play hockey, like Duke was revered. You had a number of the players that stayed around, and it was that standing on the shoulders of greatness, and it became such the whole idea of conditioning and skill sets was passed down, and that would have been a great, not only just a great pool of talent, but just a great way to talk about to motivate yourself. And as someone says in the film, the Russians were thinking the Smoke Eaters won this once, we don't want them to win it again, and because they'd already taken the cup once. But I think the 61 guys owed, and rightly so, the 39 guys a lot of credit for paving the way, certainly. And ironically, going back to what Brad was saying earlier, the 39 guys, Mike Buckna, who played on the 39 team and went on to coach the Czechs, in many ways, the 61 team were playing against skills that the Europeans learned from Mike Buckna and his guys who played on the 38 team. He didn't play on the 39 team. But at any rate, it's just got an interesting story about all these skill sets that, ironically get turned on each other. And another fascinating point of the film, as far as I'm concerned. Daryl, you remember that? Your dad and some 61 guys?
Well, back to Mike Buckna, I as a young man, I missed all of that. I'm 10 years after 1939 championships.
Yeah.
So when I grew up as a young guy, my dad would take me to visit the odd old smoke eater, and Mike Buckna in particular, he lived in the Gulch, which is a classic part of Trail, and he ran the Montana Hotel right across the street. And when I needed some hockey equipment in minor hockey, and so we went to see Mike because Mike's going to have some of this stuff cooking around, and I got his gloves and shoulder pads and what have you. And they were part of the community. When I got older, Harold Jones from the 61 team was my Babe Ruth baseball coach. Wow. And he's a fantastic guy. All these guys contributed back to the community because they loved sports. It's that simple. And they wanted to participate in whatever way they could.
Bob, earlier in the program, you brought up the name Bobby Crom, the player, later player coach. Give him his due.
Yeah, I mean, Bobby Crum, and thanks to the Crum family. Richard Crum is one of Bobby's sons is a scout for the Chicago Blackhawks. Yeah, Bobby Crum was a player that came to the team as a player coach. Originally as a player, he became a player coach. And again, I keep quoting the film, but there's so many great clips in the film where I think it was Norm Lenardin says Bobby Crum was so tough. He used to say to guys that on my street, I was in the worst neighborhood in the city. And the further you went down my street, the tougher the guys got. And I was the last house on the street. I was raised the last house on the street. And so Bobby had he was not an easy guy necessarily. He was a guy who was motivated though, and he was about conditioning, and he was about just working the guys. You know, if you guys want to play on a championship team, this is what it's going to take. And I could do some other quotes, but I'll leave them for people to check out the film. But there's some. You know, these guys and Bobby Crum, you know, what I loved about Bobby Crum was the fact that he preached, he preached what he did himself. So he's about conditioning. Well, Bobby Crum would run around the community down the highway, running, right? Like I'm talking about back in the 50s. How many people would have been doing that back in the day? You'd be driving your car and you'd see about some guy running along the highway, and it was Bobby Crum, just staying in condition. And so he brought that sense of conditioning and huge competitiveness to the team. And some of them don't have kind things to say about him, but they all respected him, and they all realized that he was definitely an element to them winning the cup at the end of the day. And so Bobby was a huge motivator, like him or not. And Daryl, actually, to that matter, do you remember Bobby? Can you talk about
very well? Yeah, very, very. I remember him quite well, and I remember bumping into him on the golf course once. I was working at the golf course, and he was going on a tirade about something, but it was basically because he was intent and he was determined, and that intenseness and determination is what I'm sure was 90% of the success of the 61 team, because they needed a leader. They needed somebody to say, "This, follow me, boys." And it wasn't like, you do this, do what I'm doing and follow me. So yeah, kudos.
Led by example.
Led by example is the best way to summarize that.
Tell Jane thank you. If she wants to contribute anything else, tell her to come on camera. We've got this chair looks like it's big enough for two. Okay, maybe
Daryl,
later.
sorry, can I just jump in here? Daryl, talk a little bit about your relationship to the 61 team in the 50s and about the music and the band and that. Like,
that's pretty funny. My contribution to, let's call that modern day Smoke Eaters, because that was from my dad's era. There was a pep band run by a local grocer named Al Tignati, and he called it Al's Underwear Band, and Al was a real supporter of the Smoke Eaters. He would dress in a cheerleader's costume with a fake wig on, and he would march down in front of the band, and we were all teenagers playing our horns. I was on trombone, and there were some actually very good musicians, not including me, that actually went pro later. And so we were big shots. We would meet at his store down the road from the arena, and we would march down the center with a police escort for every hockey game. We'd go in there, and we would cheer on the Smoke Eaters, and the fans would be behind. It was basically the best of times. And I was privileged to hear more about that from one of my aunts, who was my dad's sister, back in the late 30s. And they were doing the same kind of thing with fan support, which you heard about with the Calgary support of 700 fans going there. They used to do that on a regular basis. They'd get the weekend off, and let's picture them as 22-year-olds, and she would go to a dance, and then they'd dance the night away, and then they'd get on a morning train to Nelson, and they would go with the team. They'd have a separate coach, and they'd go to Nelson with the team. They'd watch the hockey game. They'd come back from the hockey game in the later evening and go back to the same dance and carry on that way. So those must have been amazing times if you were a young person in that era. Must have been wild.
So earlier, I prematurely teased a photo of the 61 team in front of the Arc de Triomphe, and the reason is I wanted to mention that Trail won 15 of their 18 European exhibitions. They also played 3 games in Russia, and they won one there, lost one, and tied one. Then they went into the tournament, went to Geneva. They went 5-0-1 in the tournament that got them to the championship showdown with the Soviet Red Army team. Here's another clip from the documentary leading up to that 61 championship game.
They had to beat the Russians to win a championship. Then it was small-town Canada against the world.
We listened to it on the radio. We listened to the championship game. Everybody knew somebody personally that was on the team.
We looked at it as, we're better hockey players and we're going to prove it. And the Russians were just as adamant that they were the best.
Because the medals were awarded on a cumulative points basis, the Czechoslovak tie meant that the Smokies could only win the gold by beating the Russians by a seemingly impossible 4 goals. Behind the Soviet bench was Tarasov's fellow coaching legend, Arkady Charyshev. For the finals, Kromet elected to scratch himself off the roster as a player, providing him with a strategic vantage point from the bench to coach his teammates. A tactical move that would prove vital going head-to-head against their adversaries.
That Bobby Crom did not immediately tell anybody he wasn't going to play in that final game. That was great. That was great strategy on his part. Bobby had told him, don't look to trick anybody, to spit at anybody, to call anybody names. Show what can be done by playing together on this team. We don't know what they're going to do, but at the same time, we do know they don't want Trail to become world champions. They already won it once. We don't want them to win it a second time.
They're ready to drop the puck, and the opening face-off has taken place in this big game between Canada and Russia. It's the Russians starting up the ice. Donaghu off the lockdown across the boat. He shoots, and Mike just got to call the skate on that puck.
Bob, if there wasn't enough pressure on the boys from Trail, they're representing Canada. They're in the championship game, and they're behind by 3 goals before the puck even drops. Tell me what was going on there.
Yeah, talk about a mountain to climb. So they had to win by 4 goals, and the pressure was definitely on. And what we do in the film is we let the players kind of call the game and call some of the plays, which I think was pretty cool. And it can take you right into the game. Harold Jones does a lot of it as well. God bless Harold Jones. And and they all kind of chime in and they kind of walk us through the game that was being played. And how and we haven't even mentioned Seth Martin, who is, I considered him a supernatural talented goalie, and he kept them in. The Russians kept the pressure on. The Smokers kept scoring, but it came down to it. It became a 1-goal game. towards the end, and so at the end of the day, they climbed that mountain and they reached the top. So kudos to them.
Bob, at one point, and I don't know that I've ever been able to say this, but Russia was protecting a 4-1 deficit.
Yes, they were. And I think Norm Lenardin, another, hero. Like he said, they kitty barred and all the Soviets were doing were dumping the puck back in. They're doing everything they could to kind of keep the Canadians away from crossing the blue line and in. And except for one time when Norm Lenardin was able to kind of beat two of their defenders to go to the net. And the rest is, as they say, is Canadian hockey history at that point. And it was, to me, I get really emotional when I think about the guys, especially during the game. That was kind of at the apex of their careers in hockey. And listening to these old warriors talk about playing the game, and it's just very touching to me. I feel it really touches my heart to watch these guys recall that moment. And it isn't that amazing that 60 years later these guys still remember the plays, and without them even reviewing this, I put their clips together with the footage, and thankfully it all worked out. But this is them recalling that moment. That's how important, how indelibly stamped that was into their psyche, into their hearts, into their souls. And I find that really powerful. It's a very powerful ending in my mind.
So, Bob, spoiler alert, Trail wins.
I just wanted to butt in on Bob.
Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to butt in. That's why the film is so well received in Trail, because I'm not alone in forgetting those details, and it makes it so dramatic. Wow, I didn't remember that they had to score that 4 goals to overcome the goal against goal for average. I'd forgotten about that, and I think a lot of people had. Yeah, we won the world championship. Yeah, but the dramatic ending to it is on you, Bob. Thank you very much for bringing that forward.
Well, the players just told a story, Daryl, and I just say we were lucky enough to find footage to be able to kind of tell that. But it said for me, the fact that they could recall those moments, those plays, was like so powerful. Everybody else might have forgotten them, but those guys have been living those glory days, those glory moments their entire lives.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't buy
they win 5-1.
Yeah.
They're the last Canadian amateur team to win a world championship. We'll probably never see that again. What was the homecoming like?
Well, as you can imagine, Trail turned out again. The Kootenays and everyone turned out to welcome the team home, and they walk us through that as well. And, it wasn't just a parade, but I mean, they landed in Castlegar, which was it there like 20 kilometers away or something like that?
Yeah,
something like that. And they were met at the airport, and all along that 20-mile drive back to Trail to the parade. And they all drove back in convertibles or cars where they could wave to everybody. And there were people chock-a-block with signs and cheering and so beautiful to give the guys this homecoming. And they were just so floored by it. Because the rest of Canada, in a way, it's kind of a forgotten story for the rest of Canada. But once again, the community came out in droves to welcome their boys, their heroes, their neighbors, their coaches.
They were also welcomed in Western Canada. Apparently, the plane had to land in Calgary as one of the transfers, and that's where they got all the Stetsons from that they show up with.
Well, Daryl, were you? Did you attend their homecoming?
Oh yeah.
Why don't you tell us what that was?
Oh like? No, it was just a madhouse. You had to climb on top of any kind of building to get a view of what's going on, and it was very, very exciting. But your best place to watch it would have been on television, which didn't exist then, in terms of that kind of coverage. But it was a lot of fun.
Brad, you have a personal connection to Trail, that 61 team that we can see over your shoulder.
Yes. Well, I have a brother who lives in Trail, BC. And the story of this jersey over my shoulder here is that back in 2011, which was the 50th anniversary of the 61 team's win, my brother attended that anniversary celebration, and he got this jersey signed by all of the players who were in attendance at that time. And as I mentioned, my father, who had played lacrosse and who knew who the Smoke Eaters were very well, my father was turning 75 on June the 4th of 2011. And my brother flew out and presented this jersey to my father on his 75th birthday, which my father was just over the moon about. He thought this was just amazing. Sadly, he was very ill with cancer at that point and passed away 8 days after he received the jersey. I ended up inheriting the jersey from my father, and it hung in my closet for years and years. Little did I know that, because I didn't understand the significance at the time. I really didn't know the story, but it was just very interesting when this story came up, the poker game that I talked about. When I met with Bob, I went back and I pulled the jersey out of my closet, and I thought, wow, isn't that amazing that this story has come back in this way. So the jersey has, tremendous significance for me. Did back then, but it has really special significance for me now.
We've talked, Brad, about the connections between the 61 game and the 72 series. Mm-hmm. But to you, it's more than that, isn't it? You have a suspicion that the Trail team winning over the Soviets in 61 actually was the spark that maybe caused there to be a 72 series.
Absolutely. I mean, if you actually look at this, the Soviets were clearly demoralized and humiliated in 61. We're talking about the height of the Cold War. So a little town, the Smoke Eaters from a little town in BC come and defeat the Soviet Red Army team. And hockey was really important to the Soviets at this point in time. So clearly, this sort of lit a fire under the Soviets. And the Soviets ended up going on to dominate from that point on the international scene. But there were a couple things that people maybe don't realize or lose sight of. And that was that increasingly teams like Trail and all of the club teams across the country were increasingly losing their best players to the NHL. And of course, the NHL players were excluded from participating at the World Championships, which were in Europe at that point in time. The Soviet Red Army team, of course, totally different thing. I mean, these guys are de facto professional players, and they got very good. The other thing that happened as well, which I think is worth noting, is that in 64, Canada moved to a different system. We didn't have club teams representing Canada. Father David Bauer put together the first Team Canada. And we started to put together teams and send them to represent us in international competitions, where we were pulling together the best players from all over the place. And for a very short period of time saying, okay, now you guys are a team, go represent the country. And guess what? We didn't win another international championship at that level for 33 years. And I think that's significant, that pulling the best players in the country together and sending them over to represent Canada didn't produce a win when sending a team in 61 who were really a team were able to defeat the Soviet Red Army. I think it's a lesson.
Bob, we should mention that Trail has produced its share of NHL players as well, and one of them is interviewed in your film, and another one narrates it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cesar Maniego appears in the film. what a gentleman Cesar Maniego is. I think anybody that knows Cesar will agree. What a gentleman. What an amazing player and what a generous guy. And he's more than happy to sit down with us at his home in Vancouver and share his thoughts about growing up in trail and his thoughts on playing on the Smoke Eaters. But then, of course, he was playing on the Chatham Maroons. And he put in, as somebody said, one of the players at the time, that game, he won when the Maroons beat the Smoke Eaters for the Allen Cup. That game put him in the NHL. That game got him the attention, and that game made him a legend, an NHL legend. In the making at that point, he was a kid. He was just a kid, but that got him the attention of the NHL, and the rest is history. And the other fellow that participated with us is Ray Ferraro. And Ray, we chatted with towards the end of the production because we hadn't created the narration yet. And Ray was so supportive and such a huge booster. Whatever he could do to kind of help us out, to tell the story of his hometown. Ray was raised there, and tell the story of his Smoke Eaters. He is more than happy to help out. And Ray really he stepped it up. He did the voiceover. I worked with him. I wrote the narration, and perfectionist that he was, he pulled it off in an afternoon one day when he was in Vancouver. We were doing everything remote. Of course, it's COVID at the time, right? And he just knocked it out of the park. And he's so proud of it, of the film and his participation. And of course, he's hit the headlines recently because he's stepped back a bit from some of his duties, but he's a class guy, super class guy, and I can't thank him enough for lending his voice and his love for the team and for trail to this film.
And just to make that trail connection again, Ray grew up just down the street from Jane, and so we were dating. And we would drive down the street, and I knew where his dad lived because I knew his dad. And I'd see Ray as about a 4-year-old shooting pucks into a net. And I'd say, oh, well, I don't know who that kid is, but I know he's Eddie's son. And that's Ray Ferraro. That's the connection of the community.
And Brad, as I understand it, the 61 team is owed one other debt of gratitude by anybody who plays in an Oldtimers league, right? Okay, I'll tell you that story.
Okay.
I think they were among the first to play Oldtimers games. They went back over to Switzerland. Bob, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, Daryl was probably more familiar. No, less
just
so.
Vaguely.
Yeah, yeah.
You've got
they went back several times. Several members of the team went back a few times. That's correct. That's right.
Okay, so the story is, and this will be a spellbinding tale, obviously. The formation of those early Smoke Eater old-timer teams in the 70s led to the thousands of recreational hockey teams and old-timer leagues across Canada. But actually, I'm really sorry that I brought it up. So instead, let's close with this, and I want all three of you to please weigh in on this. And Daryl, I'll have you go first, because Bob said something to me, not to me, said something in print about how the connection between small town Canadian places and their hockey teams is like in the States, Friday Night Lights, the high school football teams and their communities. And can you help us understand? We know that in the big cities, there's connections with the NHL teams, but it isn't the same as with the small towns, even with each iteration of that town's team, whether it's a junior team or club team or whatever it may be. Can you speak to that connection?
Well, quite simply put, that was the era. Let's go back to the 50s for me. That was the era where television was coming in, but the connection to anything was way outside our circle, whereas the radio and live entertainment was right in your face. So hockey was the thing in the wintertime. You either went to the hockey game or you listened to it on CJAG, and that was your life for that form of sports entertainment. It really wasn't that complicated.
I know when I was there, I went and we filmed in Trail 3 times, and it was the second time we were there. And because the first time we went was in the middle, it was summertime, and it was important. You know, Brad was saying earlier in the conversation about getting the film underway. So Brad generously stepped forward and said, I want to be a member of the team to get this going. What do we need to do? And my first thing I remember said to Brad was like, we got to get the trail right now because these guys are not getting younger, they're getting older. And the first thing in my mind was, and we got there in the summertime, they were in short sleeve shirts when we were doing the interviews with them, right? But when we went back subsequently in October, I said, we're going back during game season. I want to go to a game for sure. I just want to go to a game and have a beer and eat some popcorn, have a hot dog and watch hockey and just take it in. And you know what? It is Friday Night Lights. There you go. The band is playing. Everyone is so happy to be there. Everyone's catching up with one another. It's a community center. And we had such a fantastic time, and it's honest, good hockey. And those are the fans right there. They're not paying hundreds and thousands of dollars to sit in there and watch their players. They're there because they want to be, and they're there having a great time cheering their team on. And that's where you need to be on a Friday night or Saturday night in Trail to watch the boys play. And it was an amazing experience, and made me feel even closer to the team. That legacy continues, it was a magical night for me.
Brad, any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm just reminded of a little statistic that I came upon not long ago, and that was I read that Canada has, I think it's something like 53 communities with populations over 100,000 and approximately 400 communities with populations under 100,000. And it just reminded me of how many small town teams there are, whether it's hockey or otherwise, and why small town sports, hockey in particular, is so incredibly important in a country like Canada and the US and other countries as well. But we tend to focus on the national teams or the NHL or the professionals, and we lose sight of just how incredibly important these small town teams are to the huge number of communities, and they don't get the attention, they don't get the media, but it really plays a massive role in our country.
If there was one quote from the documentary that really stuck with me, it was one of the 61 players, Don Fletcher, and he said, I never had brothers. This team, they were my brothers. That's powerful stuff, and brought home beautifully in this documentary. So, Bob, where can people find this documentary to watch it?
Well, TSN is airing it several more times over the next little while. I don't know what the air dates are. And then beginning in December, it's going to be streaming on Hollywood Suites. And that's where it is in the near future. Brad and I are looking at trying to see if we can get this into some film festivals, sports film festivals. So we'd like to get it overseas, of course, because we feel there's an audience over there that would really appreciate the Smoke Eaters story. It's part of their hockey history as well. And so hopefully coming to a screen near you. We've got, we think that it's got to get out there, and it's a great story. It's a great, honest story about about a community, about a hockey team, and about being a world beater.
Is there a way that folks in the States can watch it?
Good question.
Yeah.
Brad, we got to work on that.
Yeah, we'll have to speak to Hollywood Suite, which is a cable station here. Our contact there, a fellow named Mike McLaughlin, has spoken to us about, I think through them, it may be available in a number of streaming services at some point. So, but we don't have details on that quite yet.
Okay, very good. If you do get back to us, we'll be happy to mention it on a future Hockey Time Machine.
Thank you.
But for right now, Daryl, Bob, Brad, it has been so much fun for me, and I'm sure for our audience, to share the stories that you unearthed about both of these teams that deserve to be told to future generations, and it'll now always be available through this documentary. So thank you so much for taking an hour and a half and spending the time with us. We really do appreciate all three of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Hockey Time Machine.